Welcome back to the Present Stage Conversations with Theater Writers. My name is Dan Rubins, and I'm a theater critic, a composer, and an arts nonprofit leader. My guest today is Troy Anthony, who's the composer and lyricist, adapter of Pericles, which is a concert experience, a musical adaptation of the Shakespeare play as part of Public Works, which is the public theater's annual tradition of bringing over 100 community members from a bunch of different community organizations to perform a musical adaptation, usually of a Shakespeare play, occasionally Disney's Hercules, um, and alongside a number of really top tier Broadway talent. And so last 2 years ago, before the Delacorte's renovation, I spoke to Benjamin Velez, who adapted The Tempest. That's episode 15, I believe. So quite early on in the podcast history. Today I'm talking to Troy Anthony, and Pericles did not take place in the Delacorte in this iteration because the Delacorte opened kind of late in the summer. 12th Night is currently running in there with Lupita Nyong'o, Sandra Oh, Peter Dinklage, etc. And instead, Pericles is taking place at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, which is really an extraordinary venue. We talk about what it was like to stage and design sound and figure out how to make use of this extraordinary, gigantic space. And we also talk a lot about Troy Anthony's history with the Public Works program as a performer, as an artist, as a coordinator for one of those organizations, relationship with the program in the past, and how he understood the community ethos and integrated that into his writing of this adaptation. I'm a bit of a Pericles nerd myself, so we kind of go deep diving into the adaptation and sort of what other productions have done with the text. And I was just really excited to have this conversation truly like 12 hours after the first performance of this massive show, which is really exciting and a privilege to get to speak to him. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Troy Anthony. Pericles runs at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine through Tuesday, September 2nd. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Troy Anthony. Troy Anthony, welcome to the Present Stage.
Hello, Dan.
So this is really exciting. I've done some interviews with folks like 12 hours after I've seen the show, but it's unusual that I've done it 12 hours after the first public performance of a show. So my first question is, how are you doing? Because Pericles premiered in front of a live audience, a gigantic live audience for the first time, literally like was done 12 hours ago. So how are you feeling this morning?
Yeah, I feel wild. I mean, I was like pacing around like before the show started, like, just like, and I just kind of frantic. And I looked at Oscar Eustace, artistic director of the public, and I was like, how do you process something like this? Like how like I can't be present. And he was like, "Oh, you just, live through the memories later." And I was like, "Got it. So I'll
You're
just be as
collecting memories for later to
yes."
look at in the future. Yeah.
And so that's how I feel right now. I feel like there's a record button on, and I'm just gonna hope that I capture as much of it as possible later on.
Yeah, I mean, the I've only been in that space, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, one other time, and it really is such an extraordinary place for theater and music. What is it? What was the experience like? Obviously, you'd been there for some rehearsals, but what was it like having a full room and hearing your music reverberate in that space with that full to the brim of human beings?
I mean, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine is, I think, the largest Gothic cathedral in the world, or something like that. And it is beautiful, like stunningly gorgeous. And, I think about the history of all the sounds and prayers that have been made in that space. I like to think that like, a sound wave never really like goes anywhere, that there's some remnants of that that I get to add my music to. That feels really special. Um, and also it was a challenge. I mean, I'm doing music in that space that probably was never intended
Hmm.
for, cathedral, 8-second reverb, delay, I mean. uh acoustic. So we've been just in that space trying to like understand how sound works in there. And there are moments that just feel glorious. Like, you know, the first time I heard the opening number, it was like a wall of sound and
Yeah,
it was
I experienced the same thing from
gorgeous.
the rules back. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, no, absolutely. And it feels like, I mean, I've been following the public works program for a number of years, and it feels like, much as I love the Delacorte and was there a few days ago, I I feel like there's something really cool in the core, especially because this is such a choral piece, in
Mhm.
having a space that sort of amplifies sound in such a specific way, where that wall of voices and wall of like community voices is so present.
It's true. I started as being in the pageant. Uh, I was a partner liaison at DreamYard and got to be in the pageants. So the Delacorte just has a very special place in my heart. And this was originally written for the Delacorte. We were going to try to do it in 2021, but the pandemic had its own plans, and so we weren't able to do it then. And so, like, really conceiving and like thinking about what it would mean to do the piece in this space um, was really special. And thinking about this kind of like concert experience was also just fun to dream about with Carl, our director, who's such a beautiful and imaginative spirit, and Tiffany, our choreographer. So that's all been really lovely. And I keep saying the cathedral is literally a character in the show. Um, there are things that we're doing in there that we won't be able to do ever again. There's a huge pipe organ in there, and I was like, well, somebody needs to play that.
Yeah.
That needs to be a part of the show. That aisleway,
The aisle, the endless aisle, yeah.
the endless aisle, the opening scene is a wedding, essentially. I was like, well, let's make a wedding,
Yeah.
Um, so there are things that are just really special about this space and ways that it made the piece come alive that just will never, I don't think will ever really happen again. So that's just very lovely.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about, before we get into the details of Pericles, I'd love to hear more about your history with public works,
Mm,
because it's such a exciting journey that and I think I have some questions about, sort of, it felt like this was written in a way really informed by your sort of intimate knowledge of the experience for the community participants. So I'd love to hear more about sort of what that experience was as a member of one of those organizations.
wow. Well, 9 years ago, I think, I was a part of the first cast of Twelfth Night by Shana Tao. I played Sebastian opposite Tony winner Nikki James. I, had done some acting before, but it was nothing as big as this. And I feel like I really got thrown into the program in a beautiful way. Um, I had just started working at DreamYard, which is an art and social justice nonprofit in the Bronx, and I was working a full 8 hour day and then going from the Bronx down to the public theater, more than 3 times a week, like as a featured role, just to rehearse. So I really understood like that part of it. Um, and I also the next year I was in As You Like It. I played another featured role, Andy. We did 12th Night again. I reprised my role as Sebastian. And then I did Hercules, where I was in the community ensemble. And that was probably the show that I was most informed by. As a featured cast member, you just do have a different experience. I had lines, I had, scenes. It was a lot more intimate. And just by design of the program, because the community ensemble only comes 3 times a week, it's more limited. It's like kind of all the parts of the show that you can be in with like full choreography. So sometimes we would get put in groups and like this group would learn this number and this group would learn this number. And then we would put it all together and kind of show and tell at the end. And that was always really wonderful. But I always felt like I wanted to make a show that felt like the community was the star. You know, we have these beautiful um equity actors, you know, Auntie Blinks Wood, like the best of the best. Crystal Lucas Perry, Danae Benton, Alex Newell, Amina Faye, like incredible, incredible, incredible artists. And they do shine in the show. But I was like, I want to do something, you know, that only Public Works can do,
Mm.
which is kind of always the assignment. Um, and yes, I wanted us to all make something together, like to not feel separated. And I also wanted to kind of raise the bar on the challenge of like, I think you all can do some more intense music. You know, I knew that this would be like a less choreo heavy show because, you know,
Right.
there were no like entries and exits and things. So I was like, no, let's like really dig into the music and like see what we can make together. Um, and that's been really special, watching them just rise to the occasion. You know, this is also, I believe, there are 49, you know, roles, like speaking roles in the show. Um, just because Pericles is such an epic, you know,
Yeah.
journey. And I was like, yeah, we will create more roles. Like everybody speaks, you know, I wanted everyone to really feel celebrated and at the center and seen. Um,
Yeah, and I think I mean one of my questions was it did really feel to me like more than past public works shows that the sort of individual featuring of community members of the community ensemble was really a central part of the storytelling, both in singing moments and speaking moments, which I feel like is something newer. I mean, I was especially excited to see that Vivian Jet Brown, who has the big solo, the community member with the big solo in every finale, was back. My first thing when I got the program was like, is she here? So that was really exciting. But just to feature sort of a whole range of performers from all different backgrounds and all different organizations was really exciting.
it's literally been the honor of my career thus far. You know, I have my own kind of community practice. I have a choir called the Fire Ensemble, which is also for this year a featured kind of community partner. Um, and so the ways in which we like rehearse, the way that we work together, is really important to me. And so another big part of me working with Public Works was like, how do we do this rehearsal process in a way that feels very Public Works, but also feels very like Troy Anthony.
Yeah,
um and that was also like so special. I do feel like because I had this relationship with the program, like we were just able to go to a deeper level of collaboration that I don't think my predecessors, you know, have had the
right.
luxury of doing, other than Shayna, who like, you know, got to come back and do it again.
Yeah.
And you know, honestly, Shayna was a huge support and influence on me in creating this piece. She gave me a lot of pointers, some of which I completely ignored,
Mhm.
and maybe shouldn't have. Um, and you know, I yeah, I'm really proud of what we made.
I'm curious. I was at an event that you were on a panel for earlier in the summer with Sahim Ali talking about Twelfth Night and Rebecca Martinez and Julian Mesri talking about uh, their Much Ado adaptation. And I asked the question, which I'll ask again since I got to hear the answer, but other folks haven't, about your engagement with the scholars on in the public sphere. I saw this was
Yes,
co-dramaturged by Ayanna Thompson, who I years ago got coffee with, and it was like a transcendent transcendent
correct.
experience.
That's
Um,
correct.
who's like the greatest, I don't know, the greatest Shakespeare scholar in my opinion, out there. So would just love to hear sort of how you, in coming to this text, which I think you said you didn't have a lot of knowledge of, sort of found your way to this adaptation and to feeling ownership of it.
You know, it's so funny. I keep kind of lovingly saying like Pericles was an assignment. Um, it wasn't quite that dramatic, but you know, the play was presented to me as like, would you like to adapt this? And I was like, what is Pericles? You know, I don't call myself a Shakespeare girly, you know, like I'm not, beholden to the text, but I love the stories. I do enjoy the plays. But Pericles is not one that I knew about. And there's another kind of scholar in residence at the public. His name is Jim, and he told the story to me in layman's terms, with all of its twists and turns. He's like, yeah, and then there's a storm, and then there are pirates. And I was like, this is epic. Like this is a wild story, number one. And it made me want to dig in deeper. And then we went line by line through the text, and he helped me understand, you know, the the brilliance and the messiness and the, like, I don't know why Shakespeare did this, or oh, he didn't actually write this part.
Right.
I got to really understand all of it, and then I started to feel like a Shakespeare scholar of my own. Then literally years later, enter Ayana and Jesse Cameron Alec, who are two incredibly wonderful, you know, humans. Like, and Ayana is a black woman, Jesse is also black. The three of us talking about the Shakespeare play felt like some revolutionary act to me. And, I set the entire show kind of in the world of like black culture, all these references to black culture. And talking to them about those parallels and like, oh, where I could lift something out of the text to kind of bring that forward. That was all very wonderful. And mostly Ayana was also there to make sure that in my cutting and edits that I didn't do anything stupid.
Hmm.
It's like, well, that line actually goes with this line, like for it to make sense. It has been an honor, literally a pleasure to work with them. And you know, I am. People are like, Troy, you did such a good job. I'm like, behind me, next to me, actually, in a circle, there are many, 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 many people whose thoughts, ideas, and um, intellectualism made it onto the page and into the story. So um, I feel really grateful, mostly because, adapting a Shakespeare play can feel challenging is the wrong word. It can feel like, a big mountain is in front of you that you now have to climb. And so I was really grateful for help in figuring out what to cut, um, how to streamline the story, uh, yeah, that was really lovely.
Can you talk about sort of when you first were encountering the story, how clearly moments of song came to you, especially sort of moments of choral music, because it is, as you said, the ensemble really is the star, and it's kind of like an oratorio in that way, where it's really about the sort of choral storytelling of it. And I'm curious, sort of, how quickly that emerged for you as something that you saw those moments, and how much you had to kind of tease them out over time.
The idea to make the community into a choir came pretty instantaneously. Um, Especially once I realized, there's a narrator in the story, Gower, who actually seems like a pretty defining characteristic of this play. Like we don't usually have narrators in Shakespeare plays. Um, so I knew that this needed to be some sort of, community journey. And they say you write what you know. I grew up deeply, deeply entrenched in gospel music and choir music. One of my biggest inspirations, like literally, if I had to say, uh, who's most influenced your career, is a wonderful human by the name of Donald Lawrence, who came to the show last night, and he, I was talking to him. I was like, he has an album called Bible Stories. It was his second album, I believe, with the Tri-City Singers, one of the best choirs ever to roam the face of this planet. And Bible Stories is like I call it a gospel musical theater concept album. It's like all the choirs, like, there's a stranger in town, he's turning water to wine, this choir is like talking about all this in this like
Yeah.
dramatic fashion. And I was like, oh, I think I would like to do something like that, I think that started to come to life, to understand like what the function of the community would be in this kind of storytelling. Um, and then because we go to so many different lands, like there's so many different locations,
Yeah.
I was like, oh, like how can I make each of these locations feel like a very specific, you know, kind of vibe, like within Black culture. When we go to Ephesus, I was like, oh, they're this is a people who believe in medicine, but they also believe in music and spirituality, and that's what brings Thaisa back to life. So I was like, where do I know that? Like in my
Yeah.
lexicon of, where we go, where do I know that? And so it kind of came to life in that way. Just neat, like the references just kept coming. And for in some ways, Pericles really feels like a patchwork of like all the different cultures that I was brought up in, and or things that I just really have reference to. The fishers are like, I'm like, I know them. I know people like who go to the lake all day and like,
Yeah.
send out their thing, and they're listening to the blues. You know what I mean? Like all,
Yeah.
all these people just really came to life for me when I just filtered it through the lens of my own culture.
I was thinking while I was watching it about the Gospel at Colonus, which the public revived like a decade ago at the Delacorte, and I saw that production, and then I reviewed the production at Little Island this summer. And I'm curious, sort of, I mean, in some ways, I feel like that model of taking a classical text and then keeping the language and building music out from that sort of is the public work structure too. So I feel like
Mhm.
it's sort of an ancestor of all of the public work shows, but especially here because you're sort of stylistically in the same worlds. I'm curious how much that show was something that you've engaged with or was on your mind as sort of a mode of storytelling.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of my favorite musicals. Um, I always take it as a compliment anytime people bring up other shows that they can see like a remnant of. I'm like, that's absolutely in there. Like Gospel at Colonus is absolutely like huge inspiration for this. Um, they use the text a little differently as like something that they're, you know, it seems I think that the way that they use the kind of preacher character was also a large inspiration for me in thinking about how to center Gower
Yeah.
as this person that's taking us on a journey, but that also is like trying to get something from telling the story.
Mm.
Um, that's been really hard. That's actually been the hardest arc for me to find, because in my way of adapting it, I really tried to stay true to the text, but in the songs, I kind of do whatever I want.
Yeah.
So, trying to figure out like why is Gower telling the story at this moment with this group of people, um, was hard for me to kind of crack open because there's not a lot in the text.
Yeah.
Um,
And often that part gets largely cut from productions because it's sort of like, why is the guy still talking?
why is it here? Why is he still talking?
Yeah.
Why is this person still yapping on and on? And sometimes they talk about these, pantomimed shows, they call them dumb shows, which is not great language. I call them kind of these pantomimed moments, where the storytelling is mostly told through, you know, dance or, mime or whatever. Um, and sometimes they're very important story points. At one point we like go forward 20 years, and I'm like, well, how am I supposed to do all of that?
Yeah.
Uh, or in Gower's language is also just it's just not terribly interesting. Um, in the play, it's written in an older English, even than what was at Shakespeare's time. So you get the sense that like this person is a mystical being, like from a long time ago, and for me, I was like, oh, this reminds me of, I grew up with this woman named Nana Ya in my community. She was a storyteller. Um, and she would incorporate music and these kind of like chants into her storytelling and try to get people like involved.
Mm.
Um, and when I thought of Gower, I was like, oh, this reminds me of Nana Ya and her storytelling practice, and you know, and that was also something that just kind of came alive for me. Um, but yeah, of course, Gospel of Colonis is in there, Dream Girls is in there, the Wiz, all of those things are a part of what I consumed, you know, and they all melt in my brain, and something else with a touch of the creative spirit comes out, and you get Pericles.
Yeah. To be a little nerdy, you mentioned earlier the sort of like authorship questions around the play,
Mm.
and I know that sort of the common assumption is that the first kind of chunk of the play was written by this guy George Wilkins, who's like a terrible person
Terrible
who was
human.
like ran a brothel, went to jail for like violent crime. I don't know. And the first like I'm always just really confused by why Antiochus is giving a riddle the answer to which he like desperately doesn't want anyone to solve. Like there's just no sort of like psychological logic at the beginning of the play. And I'm curious both sort of how I at the event earlier this summer you talked about how you decided to keep the incest plot line in. But also sort of if you could in adapting it, if you could kind of like feel different authorial impulses. Because for me, I think I saw the Fiasco production last year at Classic Stage as well, which was also great. And I remember just it sort of like settled in once we got once we got out of those early scenes. It was like, oh, here's the play. Like
Now we're here.
I know this guy I recognize, yeah. So I'm curious, sort of, if you in adapting it felt sort of the like how you navigated the kind of early bumpiness, where Shakespeare kind of must have just shown up and they're like, here's two acts, like figure it out from here.
um I joke a lot, but if we charted the entire play kind of on the wall,
Yeah.
and like the first half of the play is mostly songs, um, like there's not a lot of text. It's that first kind of 15 minutes of just trying to figure out what is the inciting incident? Like what actually is the thing that makes Pericles go on this journey? Um, was hard. It was hard. It was hard for it to be clear to the audience, like these are the story points, this is what's happening, and then it was hard to figure out why. I also had the same question, why are we starting to play like this? um but I had the luxury of not knowing what anyone else had done with Pericles, and so my assumptions and impulses I found were different than people who were familiar with the play. The first thing that was obvious to me was, oh, this princess is being abused by her father, the king. And everyone was like, oh, oh, this is usually played as like they're both
They're
evil.
both evil. Yeah, right. Exactly. And I had the
And I
same
was like,
response last night too. Yeah.
what? Like, she has one line in the play. Like, all of these people are here. This riddle is obvious. How is it that this king is able to keep all this up?
Yeah.
No one wants this to happen. Like, this man must be, for lack of a better word, like an abusive like dictator person where everyone kind of has to go along with it because what else are they going to do? Maybe he'll kill them. So I was like, no, this raises the stakes for me and for Pericles. If actually the question that he's met with is, am I gonna help this woman in this awful situation like the good prince that I was raised to be? Or am I going to save myself and run? And there's no good answer in that, right? And that for me became a more interesting thread to kind of see play out over the course of, an hour and 45 minutes, which I'm told is now maybe an hour and 50. Sorry. Sorry,
Uh,
audience. Um,
um,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I had written like I was looked because I in watching it last night, I was like, I definitely don't remember any sort of moral dilemma in past iterations. It really is presented like, oops, got on the evil island, gotta go. And he said, I looked in the play, he says both like serpents are, and then just gets out of there. And now you have a scene of Helicanus chiding him for sort of a moral failure. And I think that does sort of set up a redemptive journey that is rooted in not just like he's a great guy who got on the wrong island, but like he left someone behind that he could have helped. And I think that is a really cool intervention that does that both is sort of a contemporary sort of how we would read this moment now, but also lives in the text because it wasn't like that was better then. It was just like people
Exactly.
weren't reading it that way then.
Exactly.
And I feel like it's both true to the true to the material, but also kind of the only sort of healthy healthy way to respond to it now. So I thought that was really a really neat sort of moral turn to the way that those scenes are usually read because it does kind of it just sort of kind of sits there in the play that he like shows up is like these people are crazy, gotta go.
Yes.
Um, so I think that that was a really insightful turn.
Thank you. I mean, sometimes I like fantasize about like, oh, what if I just directed Pericles, like the play? Like, would I still be able to find
Yeah,
these threads? Because for me, I was like, oh, this is all in here. Well, most of it. Like, sometimes it doesn't quite thread perfectly. And so I've added songs and
yeah,
context and, I can ask bigger questions. But I'm like, no, I think maybe this is the play. Like it's it's pretty dark in content and subject matter. And when I was talking about with Oscar about this play, I believe he told me that this is his favorite Shakespeare play. And a lot of people, like a lot of Shakespeare people, say that this is like one of their favorites. Like they love this play. And I was like, why? Why do you like it so much? And people love the idea that, you know, of the reunions, that Pericles doesn't really do anything to deserve what happens to him, even if, in my version, he like thinks that he does, he thinks he's getting punished. He doesn't really do anything that makes him deserve these bad things. In the same way that most of us, like, I don't really believe that bad things happen as a source of punishment. Um, and I also love that Pericles doesn't necessarily do anything to get it all back. He just gets through the hard thing. That is literally the moral to me. It's like you just have to, you know that even when things are bad, that, oh, it can get better. Joy is available. Keep your spirits high through the hard times. And that is when you get your reward. Um, that felt like a good, kind of moral or overarching question theme to play with. Um, and once I found that, I was like, oh, now we have a relatable human story. Now what is needed? And I we had a lot of discussions about, can we keep this in? Like this is public works, we're going through a brothel, the incest, like how do we deal with this? And I was like, people deal with these things. People deal with incest and abuse. I really credit Dreamyard as a place that taught me that when you try to hide, you know, the bad stuff from young people, it does not serve them. What does serve them is to kind of educate them about it, and give them ways to talk back to the world, you know? Uh, and yeah, so for me, I was like, well, we can't have the light, we can't have redemption and joy if we actually don't sit with this hard stuff. Um, and somehow I think that, you know, dealing with those harder subjects makes the play even better at the end. You know, when we do get it all back, it makes it even more juicy, knowing that, oh, he had to go through all of these things. Um, we've had to witness all of these things to get here. That felt right to me.
And you have an added line where a community member says, interrupts and says, "We were promised hope and joy. What is this?" And I think that there is definitely something more challenging than like Twelfth Night. And I feel like Shayna Taub had kind of an easy job at just like musicalizing what are basically like really light, frothy plays. And I think with this and a little bit The Tempest, which Benjamin Velez did a couple years ago, I know there was a Winter's Tale years ago that I didn't see. Um, like these are crunchy plays that have, as you just said, like really dark material in them. Um, and but I think the sort of joy is available ending point as sort of it makes sense that that being sort of like the direction that everything is heading in. So I guess for my final question, then I'm curious about taking that line and applying it to sort of the public works process. How would you
Mm,
describe to an audience sort of how joy is available through public works?
well, public works is really, in my opinion, the like highest form of theater making. Um, the idea that we are all inherently creative, that, you know, there are some people who go to school and study and, you know, are become like really great at their craft. And there are some people who have, you know, other conservatories. I talk about the conservatory of the Black Church, you know. Everybody has their way to artistry. It might be through a karaoke microphone. It might be through shower singing. It might be through, you know, acting out your favorite scene, doing impressions, whatever it is, we are inherently creative beings. And so to see 100 New Yorkers from all different backgrounds come together and try to make something together in this highly collaborative art form where every single person's contribution matters, um, is the most beautiful thing to me. Uh, you know, I always talk about in choirs, especially trying to figure out how to honor your individual voice while also maintaining this kind of voice of the collective is difficult. It's hard in our daily lives. How do I honor who I am, all the stuff that makes up me, and also honor my neighbor and my partner and my children? And you know, like we're all constantly kind of holding those two things at the same time. And public works just so beautifully, literally puts that on a stage. Um, I also think that, you know, it is difficult to uh rehearse the play. Rehearsing the play was hard. Um, it was still joyful though. We kept finding joy in our process. And that's what I love the most. You know, I work with a wonderful music director. His name is Sam Appia. And one of the things I love about how he teaches and shows up in space is he will not shy away from the rigor of like getting something right, but he also knows how to like coach people and celebrate and figure out like when you get it, you're gonna love it. And so that kind of joy is available, was present throughout our entire process. Um, and just finding the moments of discovery of, oh, look, we got this right, or oh, we figured out this moment, um, is beautiful. And watching people who, you know, come to know themselves as artists by the end of the process is also really beautiful. Watching them understand that they can take up space that their voice is valued, that they are seen. Um, that is the that's just something you just don't get in, everyday theater making practice. So I will always revere public works and, community productions. In some ways this is like, expensive community theater, you know what I mean? Uh but I think I truly believe this, that um the things that we do in public works are top tier for me. Um and when it comes to quality of work, you're just not going to find a group of humans of giving their all um on stage. And you got 4 more times to check it out, as it turns out.
Well, thank you so much for all that you've done as part of the public works community and in making the show. And thank you so much for joining this podcast in the hours after your premiere. And best of luck for the rest of the run.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me on this beautiful podcast. And yeah, I appreciate you taking some time to talk to me.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Present Stage Conversations with Theater Writers with Troy Anthony. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or watch them if you're on YouTube. Please leave a 5-star rating or a review or a comment if you're on YouTube. And I hope you'll come back and stream upcoming episodes this season. We have coming up, I've been holding on to my conversation with the writers of The Curious Case of Benjamin Button in London. That'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. We also have an interview with Sophie McIntosh, the playwright of Roadkills, coming up this coming week, and a really massive preview of the Broadway and off-Broadway theater seasons ahead with critic Joe Weinberg, who was on in the spring doing a sort of Tony prediction pick preview along with Brittany Samuel. So I hope you'll come back to the podcast for all of those. And in the meantime, keep seeing theater and have a great day.